And as I mentioned, this is a brief overview, so I want to spend most of the time talking through some skills and some knowledge to just help you in general. But I also want to provide some information on the areas where you will spend the most time in caring for people, which is grief and loss and visitation, as we mentioned. And I'll share handouts, as I mentioned, by email for further reading. Um, and so now I think pretty much everybody is on mute. And so we'll just a reminder to be on mute until it's time for questions, and we'll certainly weave some of that into to our time together. So first of all, just take a few moments to reflect on a scenario in the past, maybe about a time that you were going through a life challenge and you received some care, some friendship, support, companionship, however you would describe that. Think about that time and what stood out most to you about their companionship. Just take a few moments, and then I'll invite you to just share what stood out. Share only what you're comfortable sharing. You do not need to go into any detail. But when you're ready, you can unmute yourself and just share what was most helpful for you. What do you remember the most? Yeah, Teresa.
Okay, many, many years ago when I was around 25 years of age, my sister was uh, was killed, and it was a very tragic, very um, uh, I don't even know how to say it. It was sensational, and it was it was newspaper, television, all of that. But so I was struggling so. And my pastor at the time was Reverend Ben Gilbert, and he came to the house. Um, this was about 6 months in to it, from the time that this happened, and I was just struggling. And he told me, he said, "Have you acknowledged the people that have sent you cards and flowers and things like that? Have you sent thank you notes?" And I hadn't, and I hadn't even thought about it. And he says, "Mom, I would recommend that you do, that you sit down and you write thank you notes to those who sent you sympathy cards and sent flowers." He says, "Because you can tell, you can put into words how you feel, and how those words of sympathy and those flowers, how they helped you, because they
Mhm.
did." And I did not realize that you could do, that you could send a thank you note for somebody sending you a sympathy card. Uh, when you're 25, you don't think of those things, but that was so helpful to me. And I'll just never forget that. And that's helped me towards my healing and through my grief process. And
Yeah.
so I'll always remember that.
Wonderful. So you remember
Mhm.
the community that surrounded you, and the gratitude for that helped in the healing. That's beautiful. Thank you. Nancy, I see you're unmuted. Go for it.
Just a couple years ago, I had knee surgery, and several of the people here on this screen, plus some other folks um, in the church, volunteered to help in so many different ways. And it's really the first time I can remember being in a position of receiving help, which was quite difficult for me.
Mhm.
Uh, it to not be independent and not be able to do the normal daily things that I normally do. But it was a wonderful learning experience of what it was like to receive care from people, um, and care and love, and struggle with how to accept that. So I'm still learning that lesson, but it was very, very powerful for me then.
Very good. It is so hard to receive care. It is, but it is a blessing when we let ourselves do it. Yeah. Okay, we have time for one more sharing. Janet, go ahead.
Um, about 4 months after I moved to Alamosa, my mother passed away, and I was 45 years old. I felt like I was pretty young, and struggling. She was the closest thing in the world to me, and we don't have children or anything. So yeah. And I remember actually Neil and Elise, whom we didn't know very well back then, but because we'd only been there for about 4 months, invited my husband Doug and I over for dinner. And they asked me about my mom. They asked me to talk about her. And I didn't think I'd be able to, but they opened up that floodgate and they just sat and listened. And that was a very, very healing moment for me. Um, it was pretty amazing. Yeah. And I get weepy again because I just lost my sister 3 months ago. So it's all still raw on that too when we're talking about death and stuff. So I'm processing as well. So
Oh,
anyway, I have to thank Neil and Elise again and again and again for just listening, asking the right
yes.
questions.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, it's so raw, and gosh, each new loss we experience brings up old too. So it's like grieving all over again. I'm sorry for your loss. Yeah. Well, the reason why I ask that is because I want you to hold on to those things. When we're faced with the task of caring for someone else and we can feel overwhelmed, like, what can I do? Or feeling kind of inept, or, all of those things that come up. Remembering what helps us, um, and remembering that what helps us is often what we can give others. The gifts that we receive are what we know how to give others too. That can guide you. That can guide you because we can't do it all. We can't save everybody or fix every situation, no matter how much we want to. But if you know that listening is what really helped you, you can listen. If all of those things that you took in is what you can give back. But let's start with listening. One of the biggest gifts that we can give to someone is our presence and our listening, just showing up. When someone is going through a difficult time, there are plenty of people who give advice or who want to cheer the person up. And of course, this comes naturally to us. It does. It comes naturally to many people to try and do those things. And so that's why listening and kind of refraining, holding ourselves back from jumping in that way, it actually takes more effort than it looks, right? But when we do just try and start out with what we know or our experiences or our advice or trying to cheer the person up, it can lead someone to feel that they have not been heard or even feel misunderstood. And so that's why listening is so valuable. So if there's nothing else that you feel that you are doing, just know that by being present and listening to someone, you've already given them a gift, and to trust that. When we listen fully in a non-judgmental way without an agenda, we communicate to the person that they are worth being listened to and heard, that they're worthy of that. They're worthy of care. We communicate that they're not alone. And we also communicate to that person that they are not a problem that needs to be fixed, that they're going through a hard time. There's nothing wrong with them. But we can also help the person hear their own thoughts and feelings more clearly. And this helps them in discernment and in direction. It helps them in their prayers, their conversations with God, just by kind of reflecting back, and I'll talk more about that, what you're hearing as they're speaking. And so listening is an intentional act, although it appears kind of to the untrained eye to be passive, you know, it actually takes some work. And so I want to go through some of those basic skills, um, a technique called active listening. And it's a skill that allows the speaker to both work through their own problems and to feel heard. So, first of all, you let the person know that you've heard them through some of your physical cues, such as body language, being alert in your body, leaning forward a little bit through your facial expressions is another way that you let somebody know that you are paying attention to them. I gotta say, this one is a little harder because most of us don't know what our face is doing. Um, I like to say I have the perpetual worry look on my face, even if I'm not worried. If you look at my childhood pictures, you'll see that same expression. This is just what my face does. So I have to like think about sometimes when I am listening to somebody. Okay, is my face relaxed? Is my forehead relaxed? Sometimes that actually works out in my favor, but a lot of times I want to just make sure that I'm not conveying something I don't want to convey with my face. So this is something to pay attention to, and of course, eye contact. Eye contact is so important. Um, and I think this goes along with all these other distractions that we can have, such as, not looking at your phone, not constantly looking at your watch, conveying that, you don't have time for someone, those kinds of things. But also, we can be distracted not by the physical things around us, but by what's going on in our head, right? So if we're thinking about what we're going to say next or how we're going to respond, then we're not fully listening to every single word that they're saying. Now, I want to give a huge caveat to this because it's also beneficial if you hear something that you're like, "Oh, that's important. I need to hold on to that." You're thinking, of course you are, and they're continuing to talk. So it's not going to be perfect. There are moments that you're going to be thinking about what you want to say to something. It's just a skill that takes practice. And there are times that I feel like I've nailed it, other times like not so much, but it is a skill to where you can hold on to something and think slightly like, I want to come back and ask a question about that. But I'm not going to be thinking about my response right now as this person is talking. And I'm certainly not going to be thinking about what that reminds me of that this other day that happened to me. And then you're off to the races, right? You're down the rabbit trail for thoughts. So that's what I mean when I say not thinking too much about how you're going to respond and what you're going to say. And then lastly, full attention means that you're not doing all the talking. And I'll say more about that too. So in addition to those physical cues and distractions, active listening also means that you are curious. You're coming to the conversation, you're coming to the space with this person. in a really open manner. There was a term that I learned in counseling called informed not knowing. So we can do all this learning about psychology and about, all these different things that can lead a person to, um, you know, develop a certain way. But we have to hold that in the back of our minds and kind of check it at the door because every person is unique. And if you make too many assumptions, you miss things. So you're not making assumptions. You're also curious, though, about what's going on with you. You're paying attention to your own feelings. You notice them and you don't let them control you. So if you start to feel uncomfortable when somebody is talking about a certain topic, you can say, "Ooh, that's interesting. I'm going to come back to that." And you do want to spend time with that later, right? But now's not the moment. So you're paying attention to what's going on within you, and you notice that, and you just put it on a shelf for later. Don't let the feelings control you. Another thing to be curious about is to listen for those underlying emotions or what is not being said. So you're listening not just to the words that are said or even the feelings that somebody names. I feel sad about this, but you're also curious. I wonder what else is going on. What's not being said? So you want to be curious. You want to give your full attention. And then you want to make sure that you don't interrupt. Now, this is another thing that I want to caveat because sometimes you do need to jump in. Sometimes people will I'm sure you've experienced this, just run at the mouth, just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Sometimes this is due to people's own anxiety. Sometimes there's just so much in there, it all comes out. There's going to be a point where you have to say this, I just want to put a pause on this because I want to make sure I understood what you said. Those are okay times to interrupt. What I mean is don't interrupt when you're just so eager to say something or to respond to something, or when somebody's sharing something that reminds you of your own experience. There's a phrase called, and I forget where I learned it, but I'm sure you've heard it, letting the person speak to the end of their words. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. Okay. And then when you've done all this listening, and you've done all this kind of holding something here, putting things on a shelf here, and all of this mental gymnastics that you're doing inside as you're listening. That's why it's called active listening, right? Then you summarize what you've heard. You want to go back and make sure that you heard the person correctly. But you also want to make sure that they feel heard. And so you can say, what I heard you say is, and then summarize. It doesn't have to be parroting back detail by detail, but summarize and pull out some of those big things, the big points or the big emotions that they've expressed. And then when you've done that, you say, is that right? Or did I understand you correctly? Or something like that. Because you're checking out if what you heard was correct and the way that you understood it is correct. Because you may have misunderstood it. But there's another thing that can happen. And that is when a person hears what they've said, what they've shared and expressed back, sometimes that's the first time they're really hearing it themselves, right? And maybe you've been in this position yourself. I know I have. That's why I have a spiritual director, because she can say things and I'm like, "Oh, I never thought of it that way." She just kind of had a way of saying back what I just said, right? So it helps the person hear themselves more clearly. It can also help them if they need to rethink what they said. So this might be a time when they say, "Well, no, that's not really what I meant. Let me put it a different way." And that's all helpful for them in clarifying what they're experiencing and what's going on for them. And again, it could be that you truly misunderstood them, and that's okay. That's okay. And so this is an opportunity for them to clarify to you what they were really getting at. So those are kind of the steps of active listening, that full presence with all of our cues, such as eye contact and our body language, our full attention as opposed to thinking for ourselves and what's going on inside of us, being curious about their story and their experience, but also curious about what's going on for us. And then that moment of summary and pausing to make sure that they know they're heard and that we understood them correctly. So let me pause there and ask if anybody has any questions about any of that. Okay. It doesn't look like there's any, so I will just continue going on. And if at any time you do, feel free to interrupt me, because I'm looking at various things on my screen. I'm trying to watch you and my notes. And so you can just unmute yourself and jump right in. Okay, so back to active listening. Everything that we've just done as we're listening to somebody, that's enough. That is enough truly to be probably more of a presence, a listening presence to someone than maybe they receive in other spheres of their lives. So that is enough. But if you do have the opportunity or the time, some visits are just too short for more. Or you don't know, maybe you don't fully have the relationship where you feel like you can go deeper. But if you do, here are a few things that you can do just to go deeper with that person. Okay. So, first of all, this is when you can start asking those open ended questions that can help with further exploration. And these are, questions that can't be answered by a yes or a no or a simple answer. They're open ended. Some examples are like, tell me more about that. That simply like that. Or let's say that they express they came to a decision about something. Oh, what led you to make that decision? You know, or they share about experience they had someone else with someone else. How did that make you feel? Those are examples of those open-ended questions that can help somebody just dig a little deeper into what their experiences, their thought process are, their what their feelings are about something. And this is also a good time, especially in our roles uniquely as not counselors, but spiritual care partners, companions, examples of questions to help them understand maybe their faith, their relationship with God in this time. You can ask, have you prayed about this? Sometimes that's all I have to say, and it opens up a whole conversation. It could be, yes, I have. And then you say, do you feel comfortable sharing what you pray about? Or they say, well, no, I haven't. And you can start having a conversation. Well, what holds you back? And all of these questions that we're doing, I think it's important to say that we want to make sure that sometimes our words can sound judgmental, you know. Sometimes we are being judgmental, right? So that's the first thing is ask yourself, am I being judgmental here? Sometimes our words could sound judgmental even if we don't mean it that way. So this is another area. Just pay attention to how you phrase things. You might genuinely be curious, why did you do that? But when you say, why did you do that? We don't know how somebody else is going to hear that, right? Um, so, um, I don't want to put more anxiety on a situation when you're already feeling anxious about, oh, I hope I don't say the wrong thing. But it's just something to be aware of. So, really come from a place of curiosity and just wanting to explore more with a person. So, going back to those questions, though, about helping them understand their relationship with God a little better, you can ask, where do you see God in all of this? That's a question that I like to keep broad. Where do you see God in all of this? Or do you see God in all of this? And you might be surprised at some of the answers. You can also ask questions about, what brings you fear or worry right now? And on the other side, what are some things that are bringing you peace or hope or joy right now? And so those are all good kind of spiritual questions to ask. And then, as we ask some of these questions for further exploration, we can just reflect back what we hear. Again, it's kind of that summary. What I heard you say is, and then check that out to say, is that correct? But you can reflect back feelings too. Some of those things that aren't being named per se, but they're underlying. So, for instance, as you're being tentative in this, you might say, as you were speaking, I thought I heard some anger. Am I right? And give them a chance to, um, affirm that or not. And also to remember that what you would feel in a situation may not be what they feel. But even if you think that you get that wrong, it's still an entryway into empathy, you know? It's still kind of a door opening. So they may not say, "No, I'm not angry." I've had people say that. Said, it's normal for people to feel angry at God in such a situation as this." I've had people say, "I'm not angry at God." I'm like, "Oh, well, good for you," you know? But it's still an entryway into building empathy and building a connection. So don't feel like it was a failure. Okay. All right. So that's pretty much all I have to say about listening, the active listening piece. And I'm going to go more specifically into speaking and what to say, what not to say. I'll pause here for any other questions. Nancy, yeah.
I think Elise has had her hand up for a while.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead, go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah,
I'll get it.
the one, I don't know if this is a lesson I learned or just a frustration I had. But you were talking about when people's feelings are different than what we expect them to feel. And I know that when my father died, my feeling at that time was unbelievable relief rather than grief. And it was very frustrating when people would talk to me and expect me to be grieving when I wasn't feeling that. And so I think that's very challenging for us as we talk to people of what we expect them to feel, as opposed to what they do feel.
Yeah. Yeah. That is such a good point because that can lead somebody to feel disenfranchised in their grief, that somehow their feelings don't quite belong. And that's not true. That's not true. All feelings belong in grief and whatever else we experience. So thank you for saying that. Elise, I'm sorry I missed you
Oh,
before.
no problem. What if the person you're visiting is still so emotional that they are mainly crying the whole time you're with them?
Mm. Yes.
They
Um,
can't talk really.
yeah. That is when you just acknowledge the weight, the depth of what they're feeling, and say, it's okay not to talk. And you could even ask, is it okay if I just sit with you? And that way, even without words, you're still letting them know that they're not alone and that they're worthy of being sat with. And the hope is, at some point they'll be able to start sharing a little more, but it could take visit after visit where they're just so raw, but that's still valuable. Has anybody else had an experience like that where they were with somebody and you really, or maybe you were on the receiving end where it was just so raw, there wasn't much processing going on, but you remember the power of somebody's presence? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions before we move on to talking? Okay. All right. So I am going to again ask for you to recall a time, and it might be the time that you recalled earlier when you received care. And now this time, I want you to think about things that were said or done that were unhelpful or even harmful. Nancy just beautifully named something. And so just spend a few moments recalling what that was, and we'll spend time again sharing. And again, when you do share, just remember that because it's being recorded, only share what you feel comfortable sharing. So when you're ready, you can unmute yourself and just share what you have to say. Yes.
I haven't felt it so much for myself, but to hear people, when speaking to someone who's grieving, well, it's all part of God's plan. Especially, if it's a young person who's died tragically. Well, God had a plan. That those words just turn me off.
Yes, thank you.
I know for me personally, I used to be a medic and constantly hearing people, well, it was their time or it was their time to go. They no longer needed to be here any longer. And hearing that to families, especially like even if a pastor came in and said, well, it's their time, they're in a better place. Just hearing that as a medic personally, especially like if we just got done working a case, it's one of those that you're just like, that's not the right time to say it. Even if that is, they were in pain and they're in a better place now, the family doesn't want to hear that at that time.
Thank you. Yes. Anyone else? Yes, Nancy.
One of the hardest things to deal with, I find, is dealing with people who are angry, particularly at a time of death. But can also be other situations. But where the anger is so intense that you really don't know what to say.
Yeah.
You know, you can understand why they're angry, but how to be in any way healing or supportive or whatever. I have never really
Mhm.
quite known how to do that.
Yeah. I will say that's a hard one. That's a hard one for me too. Yeah. Jane, did you
And
have some?
well, of course, there's the misinformed sentence that people say, well, God just needed another angel. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have all um, said so perfectly, and this is a good segue. When we're worried about what to say or what not to say, I think if you can recall some of those things, you're already a step ahead, right? Like, this is in an eagerness to help a lot of times. In an eagerness to help that people often say things that hurt or at the very least shut people down from wanting to talk more or shut those connections down. And so, that's our compassion for the folks who say things that can be harmful. Is that we know like they're just trying to help. But we can also recognize that there are just these platitudes, like everything happens for a reason. God needed another angel in heaven. Another one that often comes up a lot is God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Well, it certainly feels like it right now, right? Yeah. So we can recognize that, and at least we're not contributing to those kinds of platitudes with our own words. And the tricky part about these sayings is that sometimes they might be really helpful for you personally. And if so, there is nothing wrong with that. It's just that being aware that it can shut someone else down. And so we don't want to be too quick to say them in an effort to make someone else feel better. Um, and so then we have to ask, well, what do I say? What is good to say? And so, first of all, I would say show empathy. Let them know that you understand why what they have shared with you is difficult to go through. Now, this is different than saying, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel," or "I know just what you're going through," even if you've had a very similar experience. And it's okay to say that. Say, "I've been through an experience similar to yours." Something like that can be connectional. It can help somebody know that they're not alone. Um, but we never really know how someone else is feeling. We know how we felt during that time. And I think that is okay to say and valuable to say. So you can tell them, I understand why um, this is so difficult. You're going through a really hard time right now. This is a lot on your plate to deal with. And that empathy and what is called validation, which is saying, yeah, of course you're feeling overwhelmed. That's validation. That can be really powerful. So it's more helpful to say things like, that sounds really difficult, or I can see why you feel da da da, fill in the blank. In addition to validating, there's another term called normalizing. Normalizing is letting the person know that what they're feeling is not unusual. Because how often do we not only feel what we're feeling, but then we think that there's something wrong with us for feeling that way, right? And that just compounds the whole experience. So telling people in however way you phrase it, whatever comes naturally to you, that what you're feeling is not unusual. That's called normalizing, and that can be very helpful. And then that validating. Of course, you feel that way. is also very helpful too. Gosh, Nancy, you brought up such a good subject when somebody is so angry, and oftentimes when somebody is that angry, if you can think about any kind of arguments that you may have been in, they're not really in a place to hear what you have to say anyway, even if you said the most brilliant thing. So, this could be a time where you can say, wow, you're so angry. I can just feel that, and I can understand why you're feeling that way. I mean, that might be all that we can give in that moment. But that could be helpful too. Um, and as I said, if you have gone through something similar, it is okay to share that. But first, ask yourself, why am I sharing this? And maybe that's, no matter what we're about to say in a conversation, in this kind of a conversation, if we feel like we've got to say something, ask yourself, why am I sharing this? If it's to be supportive or to share a tidbit of wisdom that you learned, or to let the person know um, that that others have gone through similar experiences. If it's to be supportive, that's great. But if it's more about you wanting to tell your story, this probably isn't the time. And if you do feel like that coming up, like, oh my gosh, I want to talk about this, that's great. Find somebody else to talk to about that later. That could be a good recognition for you. We're all wounded healers, right? Wounded healers. Um, so that's that question to ask yourself about talking. And then, as I mentioned before, about the non-judgmental presence and being curious. We don't want to make judgments about what they're feeling. We feel what we feel. We're in control about what we do with our feelings ultimately, but we're not in control of what feelings come up. So we feel what we feel. And another thing, and I've stepped in this too. We want to say, "Oh, don't feel guilty." You know, we don't tell them not to feel what they're feeling. Um, that's a harder one, but don't tell them they shouldn't feel a certain way. Likewise, don't make judgments about their faith. And what I mean by that is, for example, don't say, well, you just have to trust God more, or you're not praying hard enough, those kinds of things. So we're not making judgments about their faith. Again, we can ask questions to help them understand their relationship with God better, but we're not making those judgments ourselves. And then we can also, when we're speaking, acknowledge that none of us has all the answers. And even though we all crave answers and certainty, really what God wants us to do is be in relationship with God more than God wants us to have it all figured out, right? Just to be in relationship. It's common for people who want to be given answers from the people they see as experts or in a position of authority. And so that includes you as a caregiver, a care provider, right? And we can probably all relate to this to some extent. But we need to resist that temptation to believe that you have to have the right answers for them. And it is a temptation. So, and just as we're trying to be in right relationship, help people understand their relationship with God, we're we're monitoring our own relationship with God. So we got to resist the temptation to believe that we have to have the answers for them. So you, as well as any clergy person, any spiritual director, anybody, we all have the role of supporting people in a faith journey with God and encouraging a relationship with God. And so that's what I want to emphasize, that encouraging a relationship with God rather than having them rely on us for answers and for guidance. Um, that feels like a lot that I just laid out there. So let me pause for questions or reflections. Nancy, yes.
At what point, and this is assuming, that you're talking to this person a couple of times. At what point do you direct them to get professional help?
Yes, yes. So my rule of thumb, which is a rule of thumb that I've read multiple places, is 3 times. I can sit with a person 3 times in that pastoral role before I refer out and find somebody. It's good if you can to have some people that you can direct folks to for professional help. I know it's not always easy, depending on your communities. I mean, even in Loveland, when I was serving a church in Denver, I had a pretty good list. I moved to Loveland and I'm still trying to find, other than like a few counseling centers, who those people are. But if you can have at least one name to share, that's great. But that's a good point, is that um, whether it's grief or whether it's more of more psychological issues, there are things that are just more than we can handle. Yes, Elise.
It seems that every person's grief journey is very individual. And so, in a month, someone might be feeling better and being more functional, but maybe after 6 months, somebody is still pretty much deep into their grief process. So um, I think it would be very hard to say at that point, well, maybe you better go talk to a counselor because you're just not getting through your grief process very quickly.
Yeah, yeah. And that's certainly, it depends on your relationship with that person and what kind of, I guess, boundaries or expectations you set for yourself, and these uh, provider roles. In Stephen ministry, for instance, I was trained as a Stephen minister and Stephen leader, um, before I went on to counseling. But I remember in those instances, we had several sessions. I call them sessions, but several conversations with somebody, way more than 3, because that was just kind of the role. We would meet weekly or every other week or something like that. It wasn't really a counseling role. And so that is much different. But in yeah, and this is where I'm not quite sure, like, and you may not know right now what this looks like either, like how this is going to work, for all of you, providing this quote unquote pastoral care, for your charges. And so in my role now as a pastor, um, that rule of thumb of 3 is a good one to stick to, but it's just a different situation than like in Stephen ministry. So I think I think you'll just kind of have to live into that and determine for yourself, what that looks like, because you're exactly right, especially with grief and loss. And I will talk some about that, but that's one of those topics that I'll probably give you more resources than I'll actually go through here. Um, but you're exactly right. The grief journey is different for everyone. And they say it takes about 5 to 7 months for after a death occurs for someone to really start to get in touch with their grief and feel it, that there can be a few months of just trying to adjust and get through, especially if you are doing things like managing an estate for your parent or your spouse, doing all of those paperworks, um, moving, like all of those tasks that kind of keep us distracted for a while. Um, that can really, then it's going to be several months for somebody to just really feel the weight of the grief. And so but I've seen such variation in people, or at least what they present to me, you know. Some people really don't want to cry in front of their pastor, but I'm like, but I have this box of Kleenex for that reason. Janet, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, so in our situation, as someone mentioned, we're laity led. And how do we know if do we reach out to the person? Say it's a small community, so maybe you've heard that so and so's spouse died or their son died or whatever. Do we reach out to them and say, would you like me to come over and sit with you or talk with
Mm,
you? Or do we wait for them to contact the church, or how
yeah.
does that all work?
I would say both, depending on the situation. Oftentimes I hear about care concerns from from parishioners, and so I absolutely reach out um, and say, I heard that, um, your sister died, and I just wanted to reach out and let you know I'm thinking of you and that I'm certainly holding you in prayer, but also offer any way that I can support you during this time in addition to my prayers. Um, there are times though that I have had somebody call me and say, so and so shared with me some things going on in their life, and I think that you should call them. Now that feels a little different. Um, and I might ask questions, well, did they give you permission to tell me or to ask for me to reach out? Or I might ask, did they say they want to call for me? Those are those trickier situations where you just kind of have to go with your instinct. I really like to err on the side of honoring somebody's privacy. Um, And I will be totally forthright in saying I very rarely feel completely confident in whatever answer I come to. I always I often feel like either I'm not giving somebody the care that they want or I'm overstepping boundaries. Like this is just one of those sticky areas, you know? So I would say really the best you can do is trust your instinct, and especially if you pray about it. But if somebody else has reached out to you and they really haven't talked to the person that they're calling about, I think it's better to tell that person to say, I would be happy to reach out to them, but maybe ask them if it's okay for that first. Is That's how I would handle it. Neil, yes.
I One thing I know we talked about in Stephen Ministries too, but is to be able to try and recognize clinical depression where right off the bat you say, this is over my head and this person really does need help, or they're liable for suicide or other
Mm,
behaviors that are inappropriate, and it can be headed off if they have professional help or talk to a family member to get it settled out. But it's difficult, and I haven't run into that personally, and that's a scary part for me. This.
Yeah. Yeah, it is scary. Um, you jogged my memory. I need to find it. I'm gonna write this down. I had a handout somewhere that was that question, like, is it complicated grief or is it clinical depression? Let me see if I can find that handout that I can share with all of you as well.
Lee, while you're looking for that,
Mhm.
one thing I would suggest for you folks is that if you call somebody, you maybe identify what your role is, like saying, I'm on the pastoral care team of my church. So that that person knows, are you coming as my neighbor or as your, you know, just so they kind of know what to expect. Because I think it could be confusing if somebody who is in a laity-led church comes offering pastoral care and you're not sure why they're doing that.
Mhm.
Because that's a little different than just showing up and being supportive of a neighbor.
Yeah. That is a good point, too. You know, there are times when people in the church uh, have thought somebody was showing up as just their personal friend, and they came on behalf of the church, and then that person's wondering, well, nobody from the church came. Well, yeah, they did. So it's good to clarify that role for many reasons. Yeah.
I
Okay.
think we can be multiple roles in this in our small congregation and community.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I will take a look for that handout to send you. But to go back to your question, Neil, um, show of hands, have any of you ever taken any kind of training or received some kind of training on the questions to ask if you believe somebody has suicidal ideation? Okay, a few of you. I will include some resources for that too, but let me just kind of briefly go over some things that you could do. Um, so let's say you're in a conversation with someone and you're just feeling that gut feeling, and there's really no other way to describe it. It's whether the words that they're saying, such as like, I just want this to end. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean somebody is suicidal. There are times that we're just in pain and we want the pain to end. That doesn't mean we're going to take our own lives. But there could be just those kinds of other indicators where you're just getting that kind of heavy feeling in your heart, that kind of feeling in your gut, and that's a good instinct to follow. And so the best way to really broach the topic is just to be completely direct. There is a fear that if we say the word suicide, that we're planting a seed in someone's head. But all of the training that I've been through, they indicate that that's just statistically, that's just not so. You're not giving them a thought that they haven't already had. And so you'll say, you know, I'm hearing a lot of heaviness and that you want this pain to end. Have you ever thought of taking your own life? Have you ever thought of suicide? Have you ever thought of killing yourself? However you phrase it, just completely direct. Don't say, have you ever thought of hurting yourself? Because that's a different thing. So we're wanting to be direct. And then if they say, yes, I have, again, you can normalize that and say, you know, this happens to a lot of folks. You're not alone. Do you have you thought about how you would do it? So you want to see, you're trying to get to if they have a specific plan. Have you thought of how you would do it? And if they describe um, a method, ask, you're trying to find out next, do they have those means readily available? So if they say that they would shoot themselves, ask themselves if they have a gun in their house. If they plan to take pills, say, do you have those pills ready? Do that you have them with you? Those kinds of things. So the more that they can say yes to those questions, because you're kind of going in this order, that's when you know this is something that needs immediate attention. And so then you want to come up with a plan with them. So that can be anything from asking who they feel comfortable staying with them, or it could be let's call someone right now. It could be that, like, I want to get you some help, and then you go with them, or you call if you have like a, a crisis line or a mental health center that you can go with them to. So you want to get them immediate help, and never be afraid of calling 911. Sometimes we just have to call 911. If they don't if they say that they have thought of, taking their own life, but they don't have those specific means, then you still wanna take it seriously, but it's not that immediate, urgent, like, this person can't be left alone, by themselves need. And so then you can still work with them on getting care. But, I will also, like I said, and when I send over resources, there's a couple of trainings that can look up and see if you could do it online, or if they're in your area, because they're kind of like, franchises, where people come to various locations to teach. Um, But yeah, that's the hard part. That's a really hard part, is knowing that when you enter in a caring relationship, that you could go there with somebody. And not only do we never feel ready to deal with that, no matter how much training we have, but it's hard. It's hard for us. It really is. Self-care is so important in this role. Mm. Any other questions or thoughts? I want to honor time, but I do have a few more things to go over too. Okay. Um, so I mentioned self-care, and I really want to just talk more about those boundaries quickly. First of all, an important boundary is confidentiality, right? I feel like it goes without saying, but it needs to be said too, because sharing what was told to you in a moment of vulnerability is a good way to lose trust and to do harm. So we're just always asking that question, why am I sharing this with somebody? Obviously, suicide would be a good exception to confidentiality. It's also important to remember your place in the relationship between yourself, this person, and God. And in Stephen ministry, there was that phrase that you're the caregiver, but God is the cure giver. And so this is helpful for the person you're providing care to, but also for yourself, is to just remember that you could be a helpful presence in the relationship. But you can't fix or save this person. You can't take away their pain no matter how much you want to. It's just not humanly possible, and it's not our jobs. It's just not our jobs. We're there to be supportive and to encourage that relationship with God. Also, there will always be people who have unrealistic expectations of what the church can or should provide for them. I'm sure that you have encountered this before, so I don't need to go into detail here. But just know that it is up to you and to your church community what the church can and can't do for people. But remember that no church, no matter the size, can do it all. and you can't meet every need a person has. It should not be a source of guilt for you. When you feel overwhelmed or that you are carrying someone's burdens, even after you leave the conversation, um, this is a good indicator that you're not keeping those healthy emotional boundaries. And so this is just, like I said, an indicator. This is communication to you that maybe it's time to spend some time in prayer with a focus on remembering the only one who can truly heal, redeem, and see the whole picture in somebody else's life. It could be helpful to journal about what is coming up for you, what emotions are being triggered. It could be helpful to talk with a trusted friend, remembering to hold that confidentiality, but knowing that you need care too, and that's okay. Um, and again, there's a great book. If you want to know more about boundaries, I have a book that I'll put in my recommendations that I'll send to you. Just simply called Boundaries. It's a really good book. I want to talk about grief and loss, and I'll just go through a few kind of pointers here because no matter what we're talking about, there's always loss involved, and whether it's change, there's always loss involved in our lives. And grief is a natural response to loss of any kind. So there's always an aspect of grief and loss, no matter what is going on with somebody. Alan Wolfelt is somebody that I follow a lot, and I've gone to some of his trainings. And I'm just going to read a quote from one of his books. It says, an important concept to keep in mind as you journey through grief is that of reconciliation. You cannot get over or resolve your grief, but you can reconcile yourself to it. That is, you can learn to incorporate it into your consciousness and proceed with meaning and purpose in your life. So basically, many people think that the goal is to get over the loss, and this can just bring up so much more angst in somebody's grief journey they ask the question, why haven't I gotten over this yet? Because that's kind of our cultural expectations. But when a loss is so great you can't imagine ever getting over it, this can also lead to a loss of hope. And so, you as a supporter can help people understand that a griever will always remember and that forgetting is not the goal. And remembering doesn't mean you have failed in working through your grief. Um, and it also, if you do find that reconciliation, and as he says, proceed with meaning and purpose in your life, that also doesn't mean that you have abandoned the person that you love. The hope in working through grief is to move forward, which is not the same thing as moving on, and to not let the loss define you or keep you stuck. And so, just in all of the ways that I've already talked about that active listening, this is how we can help create an environment for healing for somebody, because grief is a natural process that we need to go through to find healing. And so we can just allow the other to express what's on his or her heart and mind without judgment or criticizing, trying to steer them to a different way of thinking or feeling, but also to help the person find words for the loss. Sometimes that's the hardest part. When we've lost someone, for instance, we haven't just lost the person, we've lost all the roles that they provide. We've lost a part of our identity. Like, I was a mother, I was a sister, I was a spouse. What am I now? Parts of our identities. There's so much more than just the person that we've lost. So helping the person find the words for their loss and name those things and then bearing witness to that can be that can be a real gift in their healing journey. Also helping them understand that there are no stages and no timeline in grief. Now we have those stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross presented, those anger, denial, all of those things. And she never really meant it to be like a checklist. And actually, in her writing and research, it wasn't really written for the survivors in the first place. It was written initially for people who were going through the dying process, but we've got it all mixed up together. I still think it could be helpful for some of those labels to help us identify, like, yeah, I'm experiencing anger, and this is a normal part of the process, those kinds of things. But helping somebody understand that it's not like a checklist, like we go through a stage and then we're never going to revisit it. We might think like you've gotten past something and then it comes back again, and that's normal. And there's no timeline. There's just no timeline. So we can be help them in their healing process by helping them understand those things. And then, of course, just letting the natural healing process of grief unfold. I have a handout that I'll send you called the Tasks of Grieving. This is one that I use a lot, William Worden, 4 Tasks of Grieving. And so that could be a helpful framework for you as you're supporting people as well. It may not be helpful for you, and that's okay too. Um, uh, so I want to touch on visitation too, and congregational care as a whole. I'm really not going to go through a lot on visitation, but just to say that everything that we've talked about supports, whether it's visiting a homebound person, visiting somebody in the hospital, or as they're recovering from surgery or illness, that kind of thing. Everything we've talked about applies here. That active listening, what is yours to do and not do, the speaking and that kind of thing. But this is something that can especially be shared among the congregation, not just with the pastoral care team, but it really is a ministry of all Christians and a ministry of churches to be in community with one another. So there might be ways that you can get others involved in visitation. That's completely up to you, because you do want people who can hold confidentiality, and you want people who want to visit as a way to um, live out their ministry, or the calling to be in Christian community to one another, not who want to visit as a way to get gossip, or to be a gossip, to get their own needs met or to be seen. And so, unfortunately, we do see some of that in caring ministry, right? So it's up to you, how you want to structure that. But aside from that, it is something that can really be shared with the whole congregation. And you really don't have to have special skills. Stephen ministry skills are wonderful. But when we just need somebody to show up at a hospital and say, the church is thinking of you, just that presence is a gift. Um, and I won't go into it here just in the interest of time, but I spend a lot of time in trying to keep track of people and coordinate care teams and stuff like that. So if you have questions, I use spreadsheets. I just use Excel spreadsheets all the time. If you're trying to set up structure for yourself, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask, how do you do this? You may already have this nailed down, and there's a lot that I could learn from you. But if you do want some support with that, I want to be a resource for you as you're setting this up. There are some great, besides Stephen Ministry, there's a shorter care ministry model training called Caring Congregations, you may have heard of, by Karen Lampy. She used to be the congregational care coordinator for Church of the Resurrection. And then she started this whole thing where she goes and trains, and it's a whole other model. Some of the handouts I'm going to send you are from her training. So there are ways to scale stuff like that down and think through, okay, how do we structure this? And of course, prayer teams, these are good for homebound members to be a part of as well, so that they can be part of a caring ministry, even if they can't leave the house themselves. Um, and then lastly, what I wanted to say about congregational care, and somebody mentioned this before, it also includes tending to the spiritual needs of a whole community. So during a community loss or trauma, such as a natural disaster, which we're experiencing more, a tragic death in the community, a series of losses. And so you can think through creatively how to nurture the spiritual needs of your greater community, like through community vigils and prayer services and things like that too. Okay. I don't want to keep you any longer because we're already at 3:33, but I do want to make sure I've answered your questions. So any other burning questions? I'm going to put in the chat my email address. So please reach out with any questions that come up, whether it's in the next few days, next few months. I just want to be a resource for you. And I think, Nancy, is the best way to get these handouts is just to email them to you and you can email them out.
That works. I'm not sure if you have the email string that had everybody's name on it or not.
I don't think I did.
Okay, if you send it to me, then I can send it off to everybody else.
Okay. Okay. I will do that.
And Lee, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us for doing this. This has been wonderful and helpful, certainly for me, as a refresher, but just for as everybody's trying to figure out for a laity-led church, how to go forward. This was one of the harder tasks to try and
Yeah.
figure out how to do. So it's been very, very helpful.
Good. I'm really glad to hear that because I know we probably could have done a whole nother session just on structuring care teams and things like that. So it's a lot. So yeah. Well, good. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be able to spend some time with you, get to know you all a little better, and just blessings on your ministries and on your endeavors as you do all of this. You've got a big job, but I know God is with you. So,
Thank you.
all
Thank you,
right.
Lee. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you all.
Blessings
Have
to
a
you
good
too.
afternoon. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.